Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byron of Sidious. This is a Storyteller's Corner review of Rust-Colored Rain by Otto Shafer. Over the course of my years as someone who enjoys genre fiction in the written word, I have tried more often than not to take quite seriously the recommendations from friends and colleagues who know and appreciate my particular tastes. Seldom have they steered me wrong in the arenas of fantasy, sci-fi, or horror, and I am unendingly appreciative for that. The last time someone gave me a suggestion in one of these three areas that disappointed me, it was from a fellow who isn't a friend per se, but a colleague in the arena of small press or indie fiction. As a fellow fantasy storyteller, I valued his opinion on the works of others in our shared area of narrative, so I went out and ordered a copy of the recommended tale. That tale was Into the Moonlight, a novella by the YouTuber known as Razorfist, and it was dog shit. How terrible was it? Well, I got to about page 27 and had to push it aside as a waste of my money, time, and effort. There is a video review of that on my channel, if you look back far enough. Moreover, it left such a foul taste in my mouth that I have begun questioning the takes of the colleague who recommended it to me, which is something of a surprise since his own works that I have read, only a few short stories to be honest, have actually been quite enjoyable reads. As they say, though, different strokes for different folks, eh? Anyhow, the work I'm looking to provide a relatively concise review for here comes from another recommendation, this time from my friend Cortex, with whom I did a lengthy analytical breakdown series of live streams of the Amazon Studios production of Fallout 4, its first season. I'll add a link to the playlist for those streams, hopefully in the description below here. Brother Cortex and I had one hell of a good time going through this show with one another and offering our different perspectives on it, even in the places where we had fundamental disagreements with one another. I value and respect his take on things, and when he excitedly told me about this zombie novel, Rust-Colored Rain, I took that recommendation quite seriously. Given his familiarity with and appreciation and constant poking about my need to find and read Garth Ennis's Crossed comic book title, a work that has a widespread reputation as among the most nihilistically gruesome pieces of fiction available for sale, I approached this novel with a great deal of anticipation. Was I delivered what I had been hoping for? Well, let's take a look at a very brief synopsis, then break down my primary categories for review. The basics of the tale. Oliver McAllister, known to his wife Zoe and co-workers as Ollie, is having a relatively normal day as a garbage collector, running his route with his usual helper, Sam. He's having his usual kind of chummy conversation with the amiable young woman, a CrossFit enthusiast and the only woman working for the company outside of the office. At one of their stops, the radio alerts them that a statement is about to be put out nationwide from the President of the United States. According to her, the President, a 10-kilometer-wide asteroid is at that moment hurtling toward Earth, and the Department of Defense and NASA are implementing a deflection missile strike to turn the globally lethal impact aside or decimate it, reducing its devastating potential. Before Ollie and Sam can get a full grip on their horses, a blinding flash in the sky informs them that the effort was successful. At the local courthouse, Zoe, Ollie's wife, and a licensed practicing nurse, witnesses the same event alongside a building full of panicked fellow citizens. When the blinding light of the successful intercept fades, there's all manner of chaos to contend with for Ollie and Sam, who come upon a terrible vehicular pileup in the road. However, there's a little girl still alive in the wreckage, whom they manage to rescue and get up into the cab of their truck. As a weird, rust-colored rain begins to fall from bizarre scarlet storm clouds birthed in the aftermath of the missile asteroid intercept, Sam returns to the flipped vehicle to retrieve the little girl's princess doll, getting soaked in this weird rain. And this is just where the real troubles for Ollie and the little girl, Journey, begin, as Sam swiftly devolves into a brain-hungry monstrosity, trapped in the cab of the truck with them. Zoe, meanwhile, must survive a courthouse now occupied by maniacs infected by this bizarre scarlet rainfall, and find her way, she hopes, back to the home that she shares with Ollie outside of the metro of River City. To avoid spoilers, I'll leave it there for now, folks. Now let's move along to the vital element areas for this review. Characters. 5 out of 10. Before I get into any of the nitty-gritty pertaining to the primary cast of characters in this work, it should be noted that Rust-Colored Rain suffers in this department for a couple of easily explicable reasons. For starters, this is the introduction entry in an ongoing series, and was clearly planned as such from the word go. As such, Otto Shafer commits with this brief novel one of the most common foibles of authors who are working on their first entry in a series, assuming that there will always be a later on to come back around to fully flesh out their principal cast. As such, greater depth of character development gets a little bit of a short shrift, and we as readers are treated primarily to the skeletal and muscular systems of the characters, without too many of the intricate guts and fleshy bits of detail on the exterior. I know, that's sort of a gross metaphor, but given that this is a zombie tale, I imagine you're right along with me for the ride. Oliver McAllister, one of the two primary perspective characters the narrative has us lashed to for the story, is a relatively well-constructed protagonist. His protective drive and instincts are solid and consistent throughout, as are his mannerisms and approach to the challenges presented by the bizarre zombie apocalypse he finds himself in. Some of his dialogue comes across a little bit stilted, yes, but it's certainly a lot more natural than the linguistic flow and interior monologue for some of the other characters in the book. His wife Zoe is a different matter, though, and not in a good way. When I read for entertainment purposes, I try not to let little concerns trip me up because I'm just trying to relax with a story. However, there's no avoiding the sheer volume of next-door-to-girl bossing in inner monologue and external dialogue that Zoe has with Oliver once they reunite. Part of this is down to her being a licensed practicing nurse and possessing a high degree of medical training, which does play its own part in the confines of this zombie tale. In that regard, Mr. Shafer should be applauded for bringing in medical skill and ability to the work without getting lost in unnecessary jargon or requiring that the reader have an equivalent familiarity with virology or parasitology to keep up with the story or with Zoe. Beyond being a trained nurse and sniping at her husband, however, Zoe McAllister as a character doesn't really bring much to the tale, which is disappointing, and helps bring the score in this category down. As for the little girl survivor, Journey, the most I will say is that she is inordinately calm and composed for a 6-year-old girl who is away from her family and trying to go along with the flow of events with these total strangers through one of the most horrific worldwide circumstances that one can end up contending with. Plot. 3 out of 10. While there's a great deal of interesting world-building going on in Otto Shafer's Rust-Colored Rain, the plot itself in this series-establishing entry is relatively standard fare for the zombie subgenre. Small group of survivors tries to survive a weird cataclysm, fights their way to take shelter, the shelter is compromised, the group has to escape through the encroaching hordes. The core concept is bog standard, though there is a much more relatable human relationship subplot running along as an undercurrent that serves to make the zombie apocalypse framework more tolerable, and that's the tense marriage of Oliver and Zoe, as they are forced by events to effectively foster young Journey as their ward. There's some definite promise with this subplot, depending on how it carries through. World building, 8 out of 10. This is without a doubt one of Mr. Shafer's strongest skill sets, and that is carried through with absolute flair. From the inciting incident of a 10-kilometer wide asteroid threatening to impact the planet in a planet-wide extinction event, the presumably nuclear intercept that stops that threat in its tracks, to the bizarre cloud formations and otherworldly parasite-riddled precipitation that falls from them, the titular rust-colored rain, Otto Shafer's particular scaffolding for this doomsday scenario plays out in genuinely intriguing and entertaining fashion. Clearly drawing parallels to the Rage virus from the 28 Days Later franchise, possibly Garth Ennis's Crossed comic book series, and more traditional zombie film fare, Shafer's zombies are a combination threat to any and all humans who manage to survive the initial downpours. The rain-infected do indeed become homicidal, brain-hungry savages, yes, but in the initial infection, they are thinking and reasoning psychopathic cannibals, capable of using tools, deception, and planning their attacks on the uninfected, at least until something happens to them that would, under normal circumstances, render them a corpse. If the lethal event doesn't destroy their brain, however, they swiftly return to ambulatory and unthinking hunting, striving to bite, gouge, and claw their way into victims' heads to get at that most juicy of prizes, living human brain tissue. A bite from the infected does the usual zombie thing of passing along the problem to the victim, and in relatively short order. The turn from normal human to one of the infected isn't always immediate, however, as illustrated by a couple of different secondary characters throughout the tale, whose transformations were quite expertly handled by Shafer. His establishment of just how quickly things would turn to absolute chaos is also well conveyed, and that can't be taken away from him. For world building, Shafer did a superior job with Rust-Colored Rain. Mechanics and narrative voice, 3 out of 10. There will be disagreement here. I am adding a heavy note of probable disagreement, because some of the issues that I personally take with the mechanics and narrative voice of Otto Shafer's Rust-Colored Rain are absolutely of a worldview bias nature, and I will make no bones about it. Others who read this work, or listen to it on audiobook, as my friend Brother Cortex did, will either have no bones about these elements, because they either don't care or agree with what I perceive as Shafer's worldview, or a couple of them didn't come up at all because the text was heard and not read. First and foremost, I'm going to start with those worldview issues to get them out of the way. There is no native word processing program or standalone device which natively capitalizes the letter G in God. Rather, it is a conventional commonality that, during the construction of a text for the purposes of writing a work of fiction, when a monotheistic framework is established in the common culture of a work, the author utilizes the capital G when writing the manuscript. In works of fantasy, sci-fi, or horror, if there is a contested pantheism or polytheistic worldview set up in the world in which the story takes place, it is usually left as a lowercase g when referring to those entities of higher power or ecclesiastical authority. This, however, is not a fantasy novel of that sort. It is set in a world very much parallel to our own, in a United States very much parallel to our own. Yet of the 10 to 12 instances in which God is either called upon in panicked thought or prayer, it is written God with a lowercase g. The first time I noticed this, on page 68 of the text, I thought nothing of it, because I hadn't noticed it earlier. However, when it happened again on the very next page, and in every instance thereafter, I began to grumble a bit. By the time I got to page 106, where the name Satan was given the respect of being capitalized on the S, I was no longer just casually suspicious. I was certain that this was either intentionally done with quiet malice on Shafer's part, or had been drilled into his head whilst taking institutional creative writing courses. Either way you take it, that doesn't bode well when the audience, in this case myself, is an admittedly bad example of a Christian man, but still counts himself among those faithful. This is not the only instance of capitalization going hand in hand with suspected ideological worldview and the way it can creep into our entertainment either, and Shafer commits another shining example of this when, on several occasions throughout the work, he goes out of his way to capitalize B in the word black when referring to a character's skin tone or color, but offers no similar usage of capitalization for W for white. Given this is largely down to him not bothering to mention skin tone outside of that which is black. In its own way, by doing this, he plays into the pandering notion that one doesn't notice skin tone or color when it is in the majority. It gets an extra dose when he capitalizes the A in the term afro puffs mid-sentence when referring to somebody's hairstyle. Now, that covers the ideological bias portion of my mechanical/narrative voice critique, but there's more, friends and neighbors. There are several examples throughout the book of the characters getting unbelievably lucky when dealing with the hordes of cannibalistic infected and undead, slipping out of death's grasp at the last possible moment. Getting impossibly lucky once or twice, I can easily forgive because I'm already suspending my disbelief in pursuit of being entertained by a story about zombies. But one would have to be willfully blind to not notice just how often Ollie, Zoe, and Journey manage to catch a break from cover to cover in this work. As for Journey herself, the character's name is about as massive a deus ex machina as one can get without completely breaking the flow of the story. True, it isn't of the sort that wrecks the flow of events or offers an otherwise inexplicable solution to what had previously looked like an impossible situation. But even Ollie's internal dialogue expresses initial disbelief at the happenstance or serendipity of this name, for reasons I'm not going to spoil in this review. I can give one or two positive points in this category primarily because Otto Shafer writes his high-action sequences cleanly, sharply, and with a tremendous balance of detail and simplicity, which is not always an easy thing to accomplish. Pacing, 7 out of 10. Much like in the case of world building, Mr. Shafer displays ample chops for guiding readers along a pretty intense sequence of events. While there are sizable chunks of the story's plot taking place in only a handful of locations, there's almost always so much going on that the audience isn't granted much of a chance to really settle in, much like the poor bastards trapped in the world of Rust-Colored Rain themselves. This works superbly for a zombie story wherein the infected start off as thinking cannibals and devolve into rapid-moving undead, ever hungry for more morsels of delectable human gray matter. There are only a few scenes that really linger, and even the ones that do so are composed in such a way as to make the tension ratchet throughout their passage in a way that feels satisfying and appropriate to the overarching narrative of the book. Calculation complete. We now move on to my summation. Allow me to be firm but clear in my summation here. Otto Shafer's Rust-Colored Rain is entertaining enough for what it is as a zombie novel, with a couple of elements that really help it stand outside of the usual elements that comprise your average tale in the subgenre. It's certainly serviceable as a casual read for fans of this specific kind of work. The world building and pacing are exceptionally well done, and those two factors, particularly for the zombie subgenre, are the most important ones to hit here, and Shafer does so like an absolute marksman. However, a combination of incomplete character work, sloppy luck reliance or deus ex machina, and mechanical decisions and text construction that will invariably set some readers aware of what they're looking at on watch for more ideological pandering or insult, end up leaving me with a bad taste in my mouth, questioning whether these stylistic choices by the author were knowingly transgressive or so thoroughly baked into his instructional background that they've become second nature to his work in the written word. In conclusion, If you're a diehard fan of the zombie apocalypse subgenre of horror, you may very well find yourself charmed with Otto Shafer's Rust-Colored Rain. And for such diehards, I would say go ahead and find yourself a pre-owned copy on eBay, thrift books, or even Amazon. However, if you're just a casual fan of this subgenre, or you're prone to paying as close attention to a book's construction as someone as nitpicky as I am, I'd be hard-pressed to recommend it, as it really is not a solid work on its own. Rust-Colored Rain by Otto Shafer, for me, is a 5.2 out of 10 and would not be worthy of continuing the series. That's all for me for now, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.